Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Video games as a medium of sharing information, whether this information is stories or telling you how to play it, or even sharing feedback on the actions that the player has taken, they largely exist to make you feel something. And that feeling most associated with games by far is fun. And as a game developer, I've seen it everywhere. Watching talks on the internet or even being told by professors in school that video games must be fun. But throughout the years and before video games were as popular, another artistic medium of sharing information was the norm and was the most popular, and that is motion picture. Movies were the closest well-established art form to video games when video games' popularity started picking up, as both are essentially just audio and video with the only difference being interactivity. And in that context, game makers started borrowing a lot from cinema, especially with advancements in computer graphics. It made games become more than just gameplay and written text. Now you can have 3D cutscenes, and slowly but surely video games started borrowing a lot from film studies and movies. And with that, video games started exploring two very relevant topics to this video's main topic, which are storytelling and the ability to trigger emotions, especially empathy, alongside fun and excitement. And in this video, I would like to explore these two very specific topics through games about immigration. Immigration is a topic that's not heavily featured in mainstream video games, and that is precisely the reason why I chose this topic. There are a ton of videos on this platform covering pretty much every other topic to exist. Another reason is that I want to explore a specific emotion, which is empathy. In this very polarized political climate where the far right is getting more and more popular across Europe and North America, I want to bring more attention to these games, explore their ability to promote empathy, and shed an eye on important stories that are not featured at all in the mainstream media. You could have more story than Italian plumber wants to save the princess, basically is what I'm trying to say. Well, sorry for the Super Mario spoiler, but I would like to also give a spoiler warning about the games that I'm going to be discussing in this video. The list includes The Book of Distance, The Night Fisherman, Bury Me My Love, Papers, Please, Not Tonight, and Venba. So with the spoilers out of the way, let's talk a little bit about storytelling. Starting from the very beginning, oral stories have been part of human society since the earliest civilizations known to us today. They are believed to have been used since the earliest societies and are still used in some societies today for a multitude of reasons. Reasons such as entertainment, passing down morals and values, passing down history, and preserving and sustaining a society's culture and identity. In the past and for most societies before writing systems were developed and widespread for the common people, oral stories were the primary way of recounting the history of the ancestors. And even though many of these civilizations could have written down these stories, for a multitude of reasons, they didn't care to do so. In fact, in many parts of the world and until a couple of centuries ago, people did not value written history as much as oral history, usually preserved and passed down by the elders to the next generations. That's not to insinuate that written history is somehow intrinsically more valuable than oral history, but that's a whole entire topic for another time. Some of these societies that relied more on oral stories are the Aboriginals of North America and the Arabs. Let's start with North American Aboriginals, however. I'm in no way knowledgeable enough on this topic, but I read about it online for quite a bit, so I will refrain from using my own words to talk about this. I will, however, read you this first paragraph of this article that I read from Indigenous Foundations, which is a site maintained by the First Nations and Indigenous Studies Department at the University of British Columbia. Throughout history, Aboriginal societies in North America have relied on oral transmission of stories, histories, lessons, and other knowledge to maintain a historical record and sustain their cultures and identities. According to scholars René Hulin and Renette Eigenbrod, oral traditions are the means by which knowledge is reproduced, preserved, and conveyed from generation to generation. Oral traditions form the foundation of Aboriginal societies, connecting speaker and listener in communal experience and uniting past and present in memory. Arabs, however, I am more knowledgeable about. Arabs before the revelation of Islam relied mainly on oral storytelling in order to preserve their cultures and history. And yes, they were cultures, plural, since Arabs were, and in many ways still are, composed of tribal societies. Anyways, Arabs did not know how to read or write back in the day and thus were mostly oral societies. Poetry was also huge back in the day in the Arab Peninsula, relying on their largely developed oral storytelling and poetic skills to entertain and educate their societies. For example, a job that was very popular since pre-Islamic Arabia and until very recently is the qassas, which means the storyteller whose job is to... never mind, you get it. Also, Arabs, according to me, invented dissing each other, as in 1500 to 1000 years old poetry battles in a genre of Arabic poetry known as Sha'r al-Hija. The word Sha'r means poetry, and Hija, which can mean both satirical and defamatory. An example personal favorite verse translated is, "O son of Harb, you have a nose that disgusts other noses. You're praying in Jerusalem while your nose is doing tawaf around the Kaaba," which is basically to say his nose is very large. I promise it's much cooler in Arabic, you can just take my word for it. But Arabs also used to recite such poems publicly for entertainment, again, as sort of like live rap battles. I have to stop myself from talking about this or I will not stop, so let's move a bit more in time and discuss religions a bit. Before Islam, there was Christianity, not in the Arab Peninsula specifically, but more generally as an Abrahamic religion. And Christianity relied a lot on stories in order to communicate ideas and morals. The Bible itself is ultimately a collection of books consisting of stories, many of which were oral accounts before they were written down and compiled into Bibles. The Quran is kind of similar in that it was primarily memorized orally by the Prophet's companions, until it was compiled into the Quran shortly after the Prophet's death. It also largely consists of stories that can contain direct commands or stories that are open to interpretation in some regard, but that all serve the purpose of deriving morality and a way of life, among other things. And these stories stick to people's heads and are told and retold, just like in other religions or other folk stories. The point being that stories are powerful enough that they can impact societies by being their ultimate source of morality, such as in the case of religions. Religious stories can also be used to express philosophical ideas and become a source of philosophical discourse, but so are some non-religious books that discuss religions. Religious books can persuade people into believing in God, and skeptic books in the form of a novel can take these philosophical ideas, dissect them to try to stimulate philosophical discussion about fundamental religious beliefs. A great example of this is David Hume's Dialogues, which consist of two works, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion and Dialogues Concerning Revealed Religion. The Dialogues, as I will now call them, were published 20 years after Hume's death, which is believed to be because of fear of persecution by the church. The Dialogues have three characters, Philo, Cleanse, and Demea. Philo is largely considered to hold Hume's own beliefs. He's a skeptic providing counter-arguments to Cleanse, who is a religious empiricist who defends a specific argument for God existence called the design argument, but rejects another argument called the causal argument, and Demea, who rejects the design argument but accepts the causal argument. Basically a bunch of philosophy of religion arguments and counter-arguments told through a compelling dialogue that encourages critical thinking and reflection upon some of the most firm beliefs a person could hold. These dialogues are, in my opinion, a prime example of how stories of people speaking to each other can stimulate very deep philosophical discussions, just like religious books. So far we have established rather briefly that oral and written stories in general hold weight. They can become a way to pass down history, educate others, maintain culture and identity, and make people believe things or not. Essentially, they can be good, but they can also be used for evil. Also, so far we have not discussed any of the more recent forms of storytelling, so how does technology come into play here? Can a story become more emotional if accompanied by visuals like moving pictures or movies? Does it hit harder? And what if you could control the decisions of the character, like in video games, or even become the character? And how powerful can these stories be when used as propaganda? Why Facts Don't Change Minds But Stories Do is a video by the really good YouTuber Zoe B. In that video, she discusses the importance and impact of stories in human communication, even in places where you wouldn't assume that a plot quote-unquote exists, such as the news we consume on a daily basis. Which I completely agree with. Stories are more powerful than raw facts and numbers in communicating ideas and more specifically emotions. Humans are largely emotional beings, and anecdotes and stories can be far more efficient at communicating emotions than numbers. That's why charity ads, for example, usually bring someone who will benefit from your donation and tell you their story in the ad, since you are far more likely to donate because of sympathy instead of the number of people suffering all around the world. I could tell you that in the past 15 months, At least 46,707 people in Gaza have been killed, which includes 18,000 children. The death toll means that 1 of every 50 people has been killed in Gaza. Many analysts and rights groups believe that the real number is far higher. Or I could just sit down here and tell you the story of Mahasin, a young Palestinian woman and an artist who made free online graphic design courses for people who couldn't afford it. I can scroll through her Twitter profile and show you her beautiful art, her resilience up until her martyrdom by the hands of the occupiers.
طالما معنا قلم ومعنا ايباد ووصلني تهديد خطير اذا ما نزلتش الاعلان اليوم رح يتم القضاء علي فانا مجبره ان انا انزل الاعلان واحب مع قلبي ان انا انزل الاعلان. فيا جماعه اهلا وسهلا فيكم في اللقاء. وصلوا معي لتعرفوا وين وحنتعلم اختيار.
Now I didn't do much there. I mentioned the stats and I mentioned one person's story, and I can mention a lot more. Now this story probably won't change your mind if you're pro-genocide, and neither will the stats, since you most probably made up your mind about this long before. But what makes someone pro-genocide, like, how do you get to the point of dehumanizing an entire people to the point of them being killed daily is just considered repetitive news? Well, when someone hasn't thought about something before, it's very hard for them to form an opinion on it. If that person's experience is not relevant to the topic, that's something in any way, then the first opinion provided by someone they trust, especially if packaged in the form of a fun game or a movie, will be accepted at face value. And that is something that governments have engaged in a lot. And since we were talking about killing Arabs, let's talk about the US military for a bit. According to Wikipedia, the military entertainment complex is the cooperation between militaries and entertainment industries to their mutual benefit, especially in such fields as cinema, multimedia, virtual reality, and multisensory extended reality. Though the term can be used to describe any military entertainment complex in any nation, the most prominent complex is between the United States Department of Defense, the DoD, and the film industry of the United States. And the movie American Sniper is a movie released in 2014, starring Bradley Cooper and directed by Clint Eastwood. The trailer of that movie features Bradley Cooper, the sniper, looking down his scope, or whatever it's called, at a visibly Muslim woman holding a bomb and giving it to a little child. And that child is walking towards an American tank. Now, this one is not very subtle, but the majority of American cinema really isn't. But that little story told through the trailer on its own is probably enough for someone who has no idea about Islam or Arabs to be like, look at these people, they are barbaric, they blow their kids up. A video game example of this is Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, in which there is a country that looks exactly like Iraq, but coincidence also has a dictator. They all have a Middle Eastern accent, and this time this definitely not Iraq has nukes, not even WMDs. Basically, this is how you get the soulless pro-genocide dipshit I was talking about earlier, by being subjugated to this kind of ideas for years, through years of stories designed to make up your mind. I made an entire video on Arab representation in American media. You can also watch and read the documentary and book, both called Real Bad Arabs, that go in extreme depth on this topic. The writer of the book that then was made into a documentary watched 1,000 American movies that portray Arabs, and more than 900 of these movies were classified as having a negative portrayal of Arabs among neutral and positive portrayals. In the films and television, the Arab is associated either with lechery or bloodthirsty dishonesty. He appears as an oversexed degenerate, capable, it is true, of cleverly devious intrigues, but essentially sadistic, treacherous, low. Slave trader, camel driver, money changer, colorful scoundrel. These are some traditional Arab roles in the cinema. The Arab leader of martyrs, pirates, native insurgents can often be seen snarling at the captured Western hero and the blonde girl, both of them steeped in wholesomeness. My men aren't going to kill you, but they like to amuse themselves before. He leers suggestively as he speaks. This is a current debasement of Valentino's sheikh. In newsreels or news photos, the Arab is always shown in large numbers. No individuality, no personal characteristics or experiences. Most of the pictures represent mass rage and misery, or irrational hints, hopelessly eccentric gestures. Lurking behind all of these images is the menace of jihad. Consequence, a fear that Muslims or Arabs will take over the world. But for as much hate and bigotry as stories can provoke, they can also provoke empathy, much through the same means. Empathy is the capacity to understand the feelings of someone else. Not only that, it is the capacity to feel them as well. And for our analysis, empathy in media generally can be categorized in two ways. Empathy from an outsider perspective and empathy that comes from the feeling that you are the character. The character to you is not a third person in the second option, it is you. Sometimes empathy can make us avoid interacting with the things stimulating that emotion, out of a drive to get rid of empathy, particularly if the person or character that we are empathizing with is in a bad situation. And sometimes it can be good, it can humble people, it can make them just better people. Unfortunately, most people do react with avoidance, so don't click off yet. But now imagine a war, which is not so difficult nowadays, but imagine one far away, thousands of kilometers away. Now imagine not being from a global north country, a first world country, but from more of a developing nation. That means that no refugees would want to go there. They would want to go to Europe or a North American country. You're not affected by this war and you have never heard of it before. There are no immigrants, quote-unquote, taking your job, or refugees that your tax money has to be allegedly spent on. Also imagine your first time knowing about this war is through the lens of a woman who's been living life through this war for years, filming everything, her falling in love, marriage, giving birth, the bombing, her friends dying, their bodies, all of it, the entire thing. Well, For Sama is a documentary that has been suggested for me to watch and make a video about by the user AlrightMira. And since I have made an entire video about this documentary, I will keep this rather short. The documentary is shot by Wad al-Khatib, a Syrian journalist depicting her years spent in Aleppo under the shilling of the dictator Bashar al-Assad and his Russian allies. She films everything and stays in Aleppo for as much as possible and even finds an opportunity to leave and then chooses to come back to the war zone with her husband and infant. Before things worsen so much they become intolerable and then they decide to leave for good. Now, when I first watched this movie, I didn't have much of an idea about what exactly is going on in Syria. I knew I hated Bashar and that he was bombing his people on a daily basis, but I didn't have any idea how bad it was, until I watched this documentary and it got me to reflect a lot about how powerful the raw depiction of civilian suffering is in war, and how choosing to frame these, what are essentially vlogs, into an easy-to-watch, well-structured story must have made them even more powerful. But can they become even more powerful, more resonating? And I had my thoughts the same way this video is structured, really. I thought about the tradition of oral storytelling, books and movies, and where else can we go from here? I felt like books were a more emotional way of telling stories compared to oral stories, as you get to go at your own pace and be imaginative. And I felt that movies were a better medium of telling stories compared to books due to their inclusion of visuals. And I honestly assumed it's because of having an extra layer added. But I keep thinking about where to go from here. Can games elevate that experience? But games are primarily about fun. The story, visuals, mechanics, audio, and all of the optimizing is fun. Or so I thought at least. Then I remembered that hey, you work in VR, virtual reality, immersive technology. But to answer that, I need to know what the differences are between immersive experiences and just watching a movie. Just to clarify, immersive experiences, as I'm going to talk about them from now on, are neither games by the most common definition of games, although in a sense they can be considered as games. They are more like VR movies, but not exactly, since in a movie there is a fixed perspective. You can only look where the camera is looking, and I would expect so from what I would call a VR movie. What I would call an immersive experience is a story-centered experience with minimum to non-negative gameplay mechanics, interactivity, or ability to affect the story. But in an immersive experience, you have the ability to look and move around using your VR headset, but physically constrained by your physical space, so no controller movement. Now, with what an immersive experience is defined, allow me to go back to talking about the differences between immersive experiences and movies. Well, we live in a capitalist society, so everything is made for profit. Because of that, there aren't really that many immersive experiences. There isn't just enough demand to justify spending money on them. Outside of a few government-backed funding sources in the first world, most of which expect a decent return on investment anyways, there almost aren't any other sources of funding for this rather niche medium of storytelling. This stems mainly from VR not being widely adopted by the general public as much as flat screens are. I mean, Meta is losing money on every Quest device sold, and the Apple XR goggles, the Apple Vision, were quite the flop. And even if you have any of these devices, you will mostly use them as a very large screen to watch Netflix or YouTube. So there aren't that many of these immersive experiences being watched by the few people that own these headsets. Other than the budget, immersive experiences are inherently solo activities in comparison to movies. You can watch movies in the cinema with people, or on your TV screen with people, or you can watch them alone. Immersive experiences, on the other hand, have to be experienced solo, at least for now with the ones found on Steam and the Oculus stores. And that helps a great deal with immersion. You only have the story to deal with for its duration. And this amplifies the story's flaws quite a bit, but it also amplifies, in my opinion, the emotions of the story. Other than sensory isolation, at least in terms of vision, and at most in terms of vision and sound, in immersive experiences you can also look around. You are no longer an outsider in terms of physical space where the action is taking place on the screen. You can move your head around, you can walk around in the story, and sometimes you can interact to move the story forward. The Book of Distance is an immersive experience created and written by Randall Okita, who is a Canadian artist and filmmaker born and raised in Calgary, Alberta. In the Book of Distance, Randall tells the story of his grandfather, Yunetsu Okita, who left his home to immigrate to Canada from Hiroshima in 1935 to begin a new life. Randall in this immersive experience is our narrator, and uses this time to walk us virtually through the process of uncovering his grandfather's journey, the family he left behind in Japan, and his experience in Canada dealing with the war and state-sponsored racism. The experience starts with Randall making us play a little game, and interview with his dad in the modern day 2019.
So you can throw that over to your left. You have to look where you're throwing. Keep your eyes forward and follow through with your hand like this. Those images are of my grandfather, Yonezo. I'm the kid in that one. Thanks for being here. This is a place I made as a way of thinking about my grandfather, my family, and our stories. This is my dad. When I spoke to him, he said this.
Well, you knew Grandpa, like he was so present by his lack of presence.
Then he takes us back in time to his grandfather's house in Hiroshima. We see Yunetsu playing with his sister, writing letters to be sent by mail to his soon-to-be wife in Canada, but then he receives a letter that changes his life, an invitation to immigrate to Canada. We help pack his bags, choosing what to take with us and what to leave, and on our way we go. Yunetsu says his goodbyes, Randall trying to figure out what would have been on his grandfather's mind at the time. Then we get on a ship, wave our last goodbyes, and after a very long journey to Yunetsu and a very short one to us, Yunetsu waves his first hello. We go through the customs with Yunetsu. Then we get to build his house with him in British Columbia. We hear stories from Randall's father about his childhood. We get to capture some pictures of Yunetsu, his wife, and their son, Randall's father. But then the war starts and this happens.
A war had begun. It started with registration, curfews, and surveillance. They were told it was for their own safety. The vehicles were taken away. And then they were told they had to pack only what they could carry.
We were moved primarily because we were Japanese. Really for no other reason.
What weren't they allowed to take?
Cameras, radios,
Why weren't they allowed?
by government regulations, I would think. Precautionary measures of spying and that sort of,
Do you think that that was a real danger?
never in my wildest dreams. I mean, people come here for a good life. They hope for a better life, and they were well on their way, trying to do that through hard work and everything else.
The family was separated, and they were taken to different internment camps. I get lost at this point sometimes. I don't know how to show this moment. Images of the camps were controlled and my grandfather refused to talk about what happened. I'm trying to find a way to see him here, to stand with him. Because most didn't. Most were able to look away. Who gets to tell us where to stand? On one side of a line or another? Whose safety gets to be more important than another? Whose fear gets to separate families? Eventually, my grandfather was told that if he agreed to go to Alberta and work under supervision, that he could reunite with his family.
They are being asked to evacuate their home because they are Japanese. They pack whatever they can, and the father gets separated from his wife and kid. He gets sent to a camp and spends some time there until he gets some slightly better news that if he agrees to go to Alberta and work under supervision, he can get united with his family. He agrees, gets united with his family, gets his house stolen from him and resold to another family by the government, while being forced to work in indentured servitude while living in a small room with his family with holes in the wood large enough to see the coyotes howling outside. Then the US did it, and Yunetsu received the news that his sister, we just watched him play with in the beginning, was killed by the US nuclear bomb. Yunetsu then scrapes just enough, Randall tells us, to buy a small house in Alberta. And we get to see more family photos while Randall tells us his attempts to ask his grandfather about his past and him refusing to answer, or even speak in Japanese for that matter. The story ends with Randall visiting his grandfather's hometown, sending him a letter in Japanese about him moving to Japan and learning Japanese, and then informs us of his grandfather's passing. Then we get to all of these family photos taken throughout the whole journey with the little descriptions on the back that we can pick up and look at. Now this story was probably closer to watching a play than it is a movie. Just instead of sitting with the audience, you can walk around the stage, interact with stuff, help move the story forward. It's quite an immersive and emotional piece of media that provokes empathy at the unknown story of this singular person and the injustices he has faced less than 100 years ago. Now this story is quite different from Forsama and quite dialed down in terms of shocking imagery. In fact, the Book of Distance has no shocking imagery, but I felt just as emotional and enraged at the injustice that befell Yunetsu, And I cannot help but wonder if this story was told instead on a flat screen like it is now, would it be less emotional? Will it provoke less empathy? Or does more immersion equal more empathy? Well, luckily for us, a study titled Effects of Immersive Media on Emotion and Memory, an experiment comparing article, 360 video and virtual reality, and published in the International Journal of Human-Computer Studies in November 2023, seems to provide somewhat of an answer for us. Personally, I feel much more emotional regardless of what the emotions are in an immersive experience in comparison to a movie, and in a movie when compared to text. And this study seems to largely confirm that, at least for sorrowful or negative emotions, which were the focus of the study. With 87 participants divided into 3 groups, they were all shown the same sad story in 3 different forms: article, 360 video on a flat screen, and 360 video in VR. The sad story is a story written by a novelist inspired by the story of Alan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian refugee who drowned in the Mediterranean. And the 360 part of it is essentially a time-lapse of illustrations being drawn accompanying an emotional narration of the novel. Well, the study concluded that indeed, the more immersive the medium gets, the more impactful the negative emotions become. And to quote the study, "We expected that the more immersive the media type, the stronger the changes would be for positive and negative emotions, which would be affected regardless of media type. Indeed, there was a difference in how the immersiveness of the medium affected these changes. The positive affect change was similar across the conditions, whereas there was a trend in the negative affect change with a statistically significant difference between the article and VR 360 conditions. This suggests that the way a story is consumed has a significant impact on users' emotional responses. This is further supported by the effect sizes, which indicate not only statistically significant effects, but also non-trivial effects. So this, to a certain extent, since I'm not a psychologist after all, proves my point just a little bit regarding more immersive media being more emotionally impactful. More immersion can amplify a story's flaws quite a lot, but it also amplifies, in my opinion, the emotional impact of the story. But watching documentaries might be fun for some people, sure, but the large majority of people do not seek such experiences. They'd rather watch a fun movie or play a fun game, which brings us to the beginning of this video: how to introduce player agency to allow for the fullest extent of immersion while maintaining the fun aspect of a video game. Now, as we stated earlier, amplified emotions are not necessarily a good thing, since their weight can lead us to avoid what's causing them. So alongside immersion, the introduction of choice can be a solution to fix that problem. If a person has hope in changing the course of events happening to a person that they are empathizing with, they'll tend to take it if they are attached to the character long enough. Another factor that can make a person experiencing a story not leave willingly is fun. And evolving from basic interactions like the ones in the Book of Distance to a more gamey set of interactions can open new horizons to explore. Taking a step back from VR sensory immersion to a more involved immersion with video games on a flat screen, I would like to analyze mechanics like choice or illusion of choice, puzzles, cooking, and the most innovative of them all, texting. So for now, let's start with the game The Night Fisherman. The Night Fisherman is a short story in the form of a visual novel game, published by the studio Far Few Giants with the support of their Patreon community. The game is 5 minutes long and starts with you as an English fisherman going through your day when you get approached by a boat that has a Mr. Churchill on it, which is not so subtle really. But Mr. Churchill has a shotgun on his back and asks for a lighter. You pass him the lighter and he keeps it like that one friend of yours always does. Except Mr. Churchill is looking for immigrants smuggled from France into the UK. Churchill asks for help, and no matter how you answer, Churchill then will pretend that he is going to leave, but asks a questions before doing so. And no matter how you answer, he won't. He will then start yapping for a bit before the camera cuts to the child in the back of the fisherman's boat. Churchill then asks the fisherman, "You're transporting an illegal immigrant, aren't you?" The fisherman hesitates for a second and then responds, "Yes." Churchill asks again, "They're hiding underneath the tarpaulin behind you, aren't they?" The fisherman, all sweaty, responds, "Yes." A rope is then thrown at your boat and you're given the choice to either grab the rope and leave the boy on the boat or to go to the boy. And regardless of what you choose, someone dies. If you choose to jump and leave the buoy, this happens. And if you choose to go to the buoy, this happens. There is no happy ending here, and regardless of the fact that this story really reminds me of the opening scene of Inglourious Basterds,
You're sheltering enemies of the state, are you not?
Yes.
I think the story emotionally hits really hard as well. And being given the choice to change the course of a story in terms of the final choice or giving the player the illusion of choice, both can be impactful tools of storytelling within their own right. Giving the illusion of choice especially, considering that an undesired ending is on the line, can get the player to replay the game to try to achieve a good ending. The player's rage to achieve the desired outcome of saving both the kid and the fisherman is in itself a motivating factor that amplifies the negative emotional response the player gets from an undesired ending. And while this is one outcome of introducing player agency to our immersion equation, it may not necessarily result in fun alongside the negative emotion. And again, what I mean by fun in this specific context is mass appeal fun. The type of fun the military-industrial complex with its co-produced and advised video games can generate. Money is of course an important factor, but the equivalent of craftsmanship for video games is one of the most important factors here when trying to trigger a specific emotion alongside fun. Not Tonight is a video game made by Panic Barn. The game explores the lives of various protagonists who, regardless of their background, face the same life as refugees in an alternative post-Brexit Britain. In this Britain, the extreme far right has taken power, turning Britain into a dystopia where Brits live as essentially superior to other Europeans. The regime in charge allocated all Europeans into what could only be described as shitholes to live in, while being treated as second-class citizens working for scraps and under the constant threat of deportation. In this game, you get to play as a bouncer, having to constantly check people's IDs with more things to check the deeper you get into the game. You are also required to do this in a timely fashion or you will not get enough money to pay your expenses. At the end of the day, you see your balance and you essentially try to survive for as much as possible while things get exponentially worse for you. The game operates by having this puzzle of checking IDs become the core gameplay loop, essentially transferring this one part of this person's experience onto the player, while along the way giving the player various choices to either join the resistance or keep your head down and what to spend your money on, etc. This essentially adds more to the player's plate, more things to handle and more choices to make on a larger scale, and compared to the Night Fisherman, for example, it is more emotionally impactful. Another game that takes puzzles to an emotional story about immigration, this time more similar to the Book of Distance in a sense, is Venba. Venba, just like the Book of Distance, is designed and written by a Canadian developer. The protagonist of the game is Kevin, son of Indian immigrants who came to Canada in the 1980s. And throughout the game, we navigate the story of Kevin's parents since arriving in Canada before even having Kevin until the present day. And the way the story introduces us to the Tamil culture of the game developer and his family is through Tamil food. As we play the game, we go from scene to scene, each revealing a bit more of the family's background, struggles as immigrants to provide for Kevin, and more of the honestly quite tasty looking Tamil cuisine. Food has the central theme of connecting Kevin, who often gets embarrassed and tries to get away from his Tamil roots, by refusing to speak Tamil, surrounding himself with non-Indian friends, and even refusing to take Tamil food around his friends because he is worried about the strong aroma of the food. And since Indian food is general and as visible in recent years on social media, is the main excuse for racists and bigots to spread horrible stereotypes about Indians, it makes for a phenomenal device to explore Tamil culture and the game as a whole. Just like Kevin does at the end of the game, when he's visiting his mom in India after he had relearned to make Tamil food again. Experiencing how to make the food of another culture, even if through a game, makes you relate more to the protagonist, just like checking the IDs did in Not Tonight. But this time, the empathy is not only for the protagonists, unlike Not Tonight and The Book of Distance. You get to empathize with the protagonist and his family for the different challenges they get to face. The protagonist facing the challenges of figuring out their culture and where they belong, while exploring his family's struggles to get him where he is, living off in a first world country that has good services, good education, etc. This cannot be expressed any more clearly than in this scene of Venba, where Kevin's parents before having him wanted to go back to India earlier, but now want to stay and give their kid a better life, who throughout and until the conclusion of his coming of age story never really realizes how much they sacrificed for him. So far we have established that puzzles help, but how powerful really are they? Can they get us further than just experiencing emotions? Can they get us to discuss and reflect publicly with others, even about topics that are on like the social or political side? Well, Papers, Please has a bit of an answer for this. Papers, Please is a phenomenal game, developed by Lucas Pope, a game designer well renowned for his experimental games. And Papers, Please is his first popular game made in 2013. Papers, Please is the predecessor of Not Tonight in terms of the puzzle mechanics, and instead of working as a bouncer at a nightclub checking IDs, you work as a border agent checking IDs of people coming into this fictional Soviet aesthetic-inspired country of Arstotzka. In this game, you have to survive doing your job for a maximum of 31 days. The required documents to check increase alongside the number of things within them. Each day you go to your job, call people in, check what you need to check before starting to accept people, and then the timer starts. Once it starts, you have to accept or reject correctly as many people as possible. If you let someone into Arstotzka that you shouldn't have let in or vice versa, you have 2 mistakes to make and then you start getting penalized by getting less money at the end of the day. The money you get at the end of the day is really important since you have to basically budget for rent, heat, food, and medicine in case someone gets sick. You also have to keep some money on the side in case things go bad the next day. You are also faced with many choices throughout the game that alter its ending. The game has 20 endings. You can join resistance, escape the country, or just die from a terrorist attack, and it's all down to the consequences of your action. The game confronts you with sob stories of other people, a guy coming in to tell you to please let in his wife after he does, since she doesn't have the required documents, or people coming in to immigrate and escape their own countries that they deem worse than Arstotzka. And in this context, the game gives the player a position of control against the bureaucracy and the superiors to break the law and possibly harm himself and his family in the process of helping others. While playing Papers, Please, it feels like you're doing a second job, which is the first key aspect of this game. It's fun at first, but then it starts to feel like you're doing a job unless you're really interested in getting all of the endings or something. And this led people to discussing the game online. And luckily for me, I don't have to sift through thousands of posts to find how people discuss this game online, since professor and sociologist Brian McKernan has conducted an experiment regarding exactly this topic. McKernan analyzes the posts about Papers, Please on an online forum using AI to categorize them, and then goes through the relevant posts to find out if the game as a whole stimulates any sort of sociological discussion, especially about immigration. His findings are rather curious for me at least, since what he found is that the large majority of posts are regarding the technical and gameplay aspects of the game, but that's not the curious part, but rather that a small subset discussed the POV of the agent and life under dictatorships and Soviet countries back in the day, and an even smaller subset discussed the POV of the immigrants. Discussions about the immigrants, according to McKernan, fell into one of 3 frames: the hero frame, the victim frame, and the racist, xenophobic frame. The hero frame is when immigrants are talked about as heroes of some sort, to have survived hardships. The victim frame is when immigrants are framed as victims of the hardships. And the racist frame is Donald Trump. The victim frame was present in the large majority of the posts, mostly alongside one of the other two frames, predominantly the hero frame. Another thing worth mentioning is that a little over a quarter of these posts also discuss the experience of the immigration officer alongside the immigrants. And McKernan interprets this as a result of us playing as the officer. He states, "Future work should also explore how design features may influence the way different audiences engage with immigration issues, such as a game similar to Papers, Please, but from the perspective of an immigrant and/or a game set in the United States." He chose the United States specifically since the forum was mostly frequented by Americans, and because of another very important conclusion, and I quote, "In this forum, Papers, Please does not necessarily promote a stronger critical understanding, but stimulates a discussion that is reiterative of the predominant way major US media outlets cover immigration." And his findings are consistent with what I've seen regarding the discussion of Forsama, the documentary I talked about earlier. Comments were either framing the refugees as heroes and victims, or they were shouting talking points consistent with mainstream media. Some even deciding in the trailer's comments section that they will not watch the documentary altogether. And honestly, the only thing I can conclude from this study is that it is truly difficult to breach through the wall of polarization placed by mainstream media. People tend to analyze these events through their own lens, disregarding a more outsider view of the whole situation. But I don't know if we need them to do that, since the last game that I'm going to discuss in this video seems to be the best by far at breaching that wall. Whether it is the wall between the player's experience and the character's experience, or the wall put up by mainstream media. And it does that through a simple yet elegant mechanic, keeping the dynamic choices aspect from Papers, Please, Not Tonight and the Night Fisherman, but with a fresh, very familiar mechanic, using which we get to explore our story, and that mechanic is texting. Bury Me My Love, or Tubugni Hubbi, is a game developed in France and released in 2019. The game follows a Syrian refugee, Noor, escaping Syria to Europe and trying to get asylum in Germany. The twist here is that you do not play as Noor, but in this game, Noor is your wife. You play as the husband, Majd, who remained in Syria to take care of his mother. Noor leaves on her own trying to get to Germany, but the only source of information about everything she is going through is her, through the messaging app you're using to text her. And depending on what you're telling her, she will face one of 19 endings. The texting aspect of the game is pretty genius in my opinion. This is a fix for the previous problems, quote-unquote, of the previous games discussed, since in this one you actually get to experience, although secondhand, the journey of an immigrant and a refugee that is not yourself. You didn't go anywhere. It is instead this loved one, which, to be very clear, is a situation anybody can get into. Not necessarily with a loved one escaping war, but rather with a loved one experiencing any sort of life problems, natural disasters, falling ill, etc. This rather creative choice makes the game resonate more. You feel responsible even though you didn't really make the decision, it's Noor who did. But the texting aspect of this game is, in my opinion, as good of a design choice as the Wii Remote is. Your dad, your mom, your grandma, your young sibling has used a remote, at least by the time the Wii came out. So when people got their Wiis for the first time, it was intuitive to use. And making a video game where you utilize something that everyone can do is a good way to not just reach small G gamers, but also non-gamers that want to try out something new. A lot of research went into Bury Me My Love. Even though Noor is a fictional character, the interactions and stories to explore are an amalgamation of stories by Syrian refugees who escaped Syria themselves. But this is where the best game I'm discussing today starts falling short in my opinion. As creative and honestly groundbreaking as it is in terms of engaging the emotions of the player through a very nice story, the story is too nice to be a refugee story. Sure, the difficult situations facing Noor are there, but Noor's attitude seems too bubbly, like she's going on an adventure. I have seen this a lot in terms of the feedback around the game. Going through the Steam reviews, a much higher percentage of people seem to be discussing the immigration aspect of the game when compared to Papers, Please, for example. But also when you see the feedback of actual self-described Syrian refugees in the reviews, it gets you to reflect on how the developers may have tried to brighten up the mood of Noor a little bit too much that it became unrelatable to other Syrian refugees. Some reviewers even seem to be insulted by the game. Now this can get down to many reasons. Maybe the devs intentionally tried to make the game happier to not depress the players and maintain the fun aspect, or maybe the developers cannot capture what they have not lived through to a rather realistic extent. Also, maybe the devs just came across a minority of the refugees who had it rather easier, although I really doubt that, since even the ones whom I know personally who had it easy had it worse than Noor. I'm personally unsure, but I'm more inclined to believe the second reason, that the devs simply cannot capture what they hadn't lived through. But anyways, I would actually love to see a similar story, but this time told by an actual game developer who went through it all. In my opinion, that would be the most effective way yet. Someone with the correct expertise who's adamant to make a game that is intuitive to interact with and tells a real story of what the developer has or is going through. And that leads me to the actual final game that I would like to discuss, Dreams on a Pillow. Dreams on a Pillow is a game in pre-production about the Nakba, the Palestinian mass expulsion. The game is made by the Palestinian game developer Rashid Abu Aida. The game is going to discuss the Nakba and its aftermath using real accounts from real alive people made by someone who's living through its aftermath and is still living in Palestine. Rashid made a game about 10 years ago called Layla and the Shadows of War. It's available on the App Store, the Play Store, and itch.io. He has also raised $240,000 to get a vertical slice out there, $40,000 of his goal of $200,000. As far as I know, he's looking to raise another $300,000 in probably around 9 months to continue the production of the game and pay everyone working on it fairly. You will find all of the relevant links in the description. So, stories have made a long journey since the earliest civilizations and proved themselves as powerful enough to make up and change people's minds. Probably the closest thing to mind control, really. Through stories, we can explore different cultures, different lives, and gain empathy towards others, which is something a large majority of people lack nowadays. And with technological advancements, we saw advancements in storytelling mediums. They became even more immersive, more creative, and ultimately more powerful. We still don't understand how to fully utilize them for good, but some people are trying. And games like the games discussed today, regardless of their shortcomings, are building blocks that we can get inspired from to create more, better, fun, emotional, thought-provoking games. So if you have watched this video until the end, sincerely, thank you. Please support me by doing all of the YouTube algo stuff, so subscribing and sharing would help me immensely. I do this in my free time, and if you think I should continue, show me your support, it helps keep me going. Thank you very much, and see you on the next one. Bye.